Hello and welcome to a very special Gardener's World.
Devoted to wildlife gardening.
We share our gardens with an extraordinary array of wildlife, mammals and birds and insects, and I think that as gardeners we love to see them sharing the space with us. Well, unfortunately the story isn't all rosy, because since 1970 an extraordinary 41% of species has seen a real decline.
And as gardeners, we can help stem that decline. Doesn't matter how small a change we make, it could make a huge difference. Over the next hour, we'll be exploring how we gardeners can make a positive impact for wildlife, whether you have a garden, an allotment, a communal space, or even a window box.
Coming up, we meet a gardener who wants to share her garden paradise with as many creatures as possible.
There isn't a lot of bare earth in this garden because wildlife needs things to eat all through the year. So we try to have something in flower for every single month of the year.
Nick meets an entomologist who wants to change people's perceptions about pests.
We're stood in front of your veg patch here. It's absolutely full of different creatures.
Yeah, they're not actually affecting the plants. So why would I want to get rid of them? To me, they are food for others.
And we pay a visit to Kate Bradbury's allotment in Hove, where she welcomes all wildlife and gardens alongside them.
I grow plants to create habitats for wildlife, because the more big things I can bring in to eat the smaller things, the more balanced the veg plot and the better my veg grows.
So why should we care about wildlife? Why is it so important? Well, the most recent State of Nature report, which is a kind of collective health check on wildlife across the UK, made for pretty grim reading actually. It showed that 15% of species are at risk of extinction and 2% have already gone forever. So that is worrying. But the great thing is that gardeners can do something to help. Our gardens represent a vast living landscape, and with an estimated 23 million gardens in the UK, they cover more space than all the nature reserves combined. But how do you go about creating a wildlife-friendly garden? We've come to Saith Fannon Farm in Flintshire to visit author and conservation volunteer Jan Miller-Klein, who's been a passionate wildlife gardener for 3 decades and has planted and managed this former farm to attract and enhance the wildlife in the area, creating havens for butterflies and other insects that form a sustainable ecosystem. So what would you say are the key things that one should do to try and attract wildlife to the garden?
You need food, so growing the plants that they need to eat. You need water, which, you know, you can do with a very small little dish. It doesn't have to be a big pond. And you need shelter and somewhere for them to breed. And also you need different temperature gradients. A garden is actually rather like the woodland edge or a small clearing in the wood. And it's got all these different levels of trees, shrubs, smaller plants. And the insects have got lots of mini habitats they can move about in to be able to function, because of course they're cold-blooded, they don't make their own body heat like mammals do, so they have to be able to move between different areas to get the right temperature to operate. So even a small garden has lots of different micro-habitats where insects can find the optimum temperature.
Can you tell me some of the species you have here? The mammals, the birds, the insects, what are you seeing?
I've got about 25 species of butterflies that visit here, and about 3 or 4 of them are scarce butterflies. Some of the skipper butterflies hibernate as pupae in the stems of dead grasses from last year. So if you cut or mow the grass every year, you break the life cycle. So I think that's a really important principle, is just don't do it all at one go. Just do parts of it one year and the other part the next year. But what happened accidentally, I didn't realise, what I was doing was creating the ideal habitat with the dead grass for voles and mice underneath, and that brought in the barn owls and the kestrels and the small mammals. Weasels we've got, weasels and stoats. And we've got a huge badger set in the wood. It's just fascinating. The more you learn about it, the bigger it gets. The whole ecology is interconnected.
It's that sort of thinking of all stages in an insect or mammal's, bird's life, and catering for that.
Absolutely, yes. And, you know, larval food plants is something that people don't seem to have realised until quite recently, that if you don't feed the caterpillars, you're not going to get the butterflies.
Jan's approach to wildlife gardening involves creating an ecosystem where insects and mammals in the whole food chain are provided for. And this is something we can all learn from. Now, we're off to a garden in Gravesend where the sole purpose of every plant is to attract and benefit wildlife.
If it's a haven for wildlife, and insects particularly, then it is a haven for me. When I see a new species in the garden, I immediately take a photograph of it because I'm very curious to know exactly what it is. I'm Judith Hathrill, and we're in my garden, and I call it the Windmill Hill Wildlife Garden. We like to try and provide all sorts of plants for all sorts of wildlife. We've got 3 ponds. Between them there's an awful lot of vegetation. There's food for bees and butterflies, all sorts of pollinators. There are food plants for caterpillars. There's places where things can hide. There isn't a lot of bare earth in this garden because wildlife needs things to eat all through the year. So we try to have something in flower for every single month of the year. I've always loved insects, and I'd read an awful lot and heard an awful lot about how insects are declining, so I thought, let's try and make this a garden that was more beneficial for wildlife than just a normal ornamental garden might be. This is not a big garden, so I have to try to decide which creatures I'm trying to attract and plant accordingly. Every plant in this garden has a use. This is purple toadflax. My mission in life is to protect the toadflax brocade moth. Since 2011, I've noticed the caterpillars on the purple toadflax, so now I allow it to seed all over the garden because at some point I have over 1,000 caterpillars here and they literally eat it down to the ground, by which time the second generation of moths has hatched and they're looking for somewhere to lay their eggs. So it's a constant process to get 2 generations of caterpillars bred, fed and turned into moths. It's not a common species, so I like to protect it. I've been fascinated by insects ever since I was a very small child. I used to breed moths. I used to keep caterpillars until they turned into moths or butterflies. This is ragwort. It's a weed. It's not to be grown near farmland because if it ever gets to be dried in hay, then it is poisonous to horses. But in my garden, there are no horses around here, and I grow it because it is the only food plant of the cinnabar moth caterpillar. It's a very pretty little moth. It's a day-flying moth, and I'm trying to, again, increase the numbers that we've got. I think most people love butterflies, but a lot of people don't want the caterpillars. If you want more butterflies, you've got to look into the lifestyle of a butterfly, and you've got to try and accommodate the lifestyle of a butterfly in your garden. So if it means you've got to grow plants which eventually get eaten to the ground, you have to accept that some of your plants are going to be eaten. When we first came to the garden, we arrived to find that there was a concrete path running all around the garden. So I had it covered in a deep bed of wood chip. And of course, the female stag beetle will use any dead wood to lay eggs. And so we found, after a couple of years, we would be finding the stag beetle grubs when we gently rake the paths over. You must have water in a wildlife garden. It is the one essential. Let's see if we can find any frogs. Ah, yes, I think we've got one here. Can you see how tiny he is? You look at the size of the tadpoles and then it turns into this little frog. It makes me laugh, the fact a great big fat tadpole turns into something that size. I've made sure all around both ponds there's lots and lots of long grass because, of course, when the young frogs and toads and newts leave the water, they want to find somewhere safe. Also, if it's sunny, you'll see lots and lots of blue damselflies here. They will lay their eggs on the pondweed that's just on the surface there. I love to sit looking in the pond and just see what arrives. This is the big pond. It's quite important actually to consider how you build it because we don't want anything with steep sides where hedgehogs could fall in. We want something which has a lot of shallow water around the outside. It's good to have a deep bit in the middle because then it doesn't freeze solid and a lot of the frogs will be living under the water in the winter. Not all of them will be on land. You need to have oxygenating plants under the water and that keeps the water oxygenated for the things that live permanently in the pond. If you've only got a very, very small space, then it's still important to provide water. And it's not just for things like frogs and newts. Bees and wasps will drink water. The most important thing you can do in a garden is leave the food chain intact. Everything from the smallest, tiniest little creature is dinner for something a little bit higher up. And you'll find that the natural predators will come along. What gives me the most pleasure is seeing the species that I've provided for returning or coming for the first time, growing something new and seeing that it actually works, that, oh, there they are.
Judith, your excitement is infectious and I love how you've put your weeds and your perennials all together. The garden looks beautiful, but knowing that it's beneficial to wildlife is even better. It's so exciting, isn't it, to go to the garden centre and be bedazzled by an array of plants. And there's all this choice of colour shouting at us. But if we pay a little bit more attention to the plants that are there, we could actually make sure we can bring more plants home that will be better for beneficial insects. So what are the things to look out for? Well, things like a single flower, like this. And what I mean by that is that it hasn't got lots of petals that are hiding the stamen. You want it to be nice and open so that the pollen and nectar can be accessible to things like bees. But it's not just bees that we want to attract to the garden. There are other beneficial insects like lacewings and hoverflies, and they have different mouthpieces, so they have to have plants that have a different surface to them. Things like this yarrow, this lovely bright achillea here. So they come and land on top of the plant and then they can access the pollen and nectar in a different way. And for those insects that have got a longer proboscis, like on a butterfly, it's like a long tongue that needs to get access into the tubular-shaped flowers of plants, then it's important that they're included in our choices. Things like this butterfly bush, which is the buddleia. This is great, this buddleia, because it's actually a dwarf one. Perfect in a container in a small space. Now, there are a lot of plants out there that have been hybridised, so they've been crossed many, many times, and sometimes that means that they actually are sterile and don't actually have any pollen available in the garden. They look good, but they're not great for insects, and that's something to look out for when you're selecting plants. Even if you don't have a big garden, these can be perfect in a container in a small space. It is ideal really to get the biggest container that you can afford, because that way it's got less chance of drying out. And I really like using perennials because it means that once they've died down, I can know next year that they're going to come back and it's a job done. But there's also the idea about, well, what happens when they grow out of their space? And again, it's up to you. You can take them and put them in a border if you have one, or you can pot them up and put it into a bigger container. They certainly don't need to go to waste. Now, I always like to just have a play before I take them out of their containers. But you can see now that already that there's different canopy heights and different leaf shapes that are coming into this, and that means it's a perfect place also for other beneficial insects to be able to take shelter. There'll be spiders that come into here, there'll be beetles, and containers are brilliant because they can be moved anywhere around the garden. Now it's time to visit one of your gardens, and this one has a lot of nocturnal visitors.
Hello, my name's Charlotte and I'd like to give you a hedgehog's eye tour of my garden here in York. My husband and I moved here in 2014, and at the time the garden was just a blank space with a broken fence. It wasn't long before we realised we had hedgehogs in the area. So when we fixed the fence, we made sure we put a hole in so that the hedgehogs could get in and out. We also bought a wildlife camera so that we could see what was coming into the garden and put out little bowls of food. At the back of the garden, we built a log pile to cater for insects and beetles that the hedgehogs like to eat. But we also started noticing other animals coming into the garden. At the bottom of the shed, some mice have taken up residence. But we've also had some more unusual visitors through the hedgehog hole. In the middle of the garden, we dug a pond and made sure it had a beach so that hedgehogs could climb out if they fall in. But this also brought loads of frogs into the garden, which helped us with the slugs and snails that we used to have a problem with. My philosophy for planting this end of the garden is the more plants I put in, the less weeding I have to do. But it also gives really good cover for any creatures that crawl out of the pond and protection against any other animals that may be around on the prowl. And finally, in the back corner of the garden, if you pass through all this undergrowth, we built a hedgehog house. Of course, no hedgehog tour would be complete without seeing the garden at night. Thank you for visiting our garden. Bye-bye.
Charlotte's garden absolutely fizzes with life, and I love those nighttime cameras. I want to get one and just see what's going on in my own garden at night. Wonderful. And of course, it's not just the creatures that are scampering around on the ground, it's the things that fill our skies that are important too. The insects and, of course, the birds. So doing whatever we can to get as many birds into our garden and keeping them happy all year round is really crucial. So that means providing some sort of water for them to drink and to bathe in. It could be a bird bath, could be just a simple dish that you put on the ground. And feeding them regularly, because they get used to coming back to certain gardens if they know that the food's going to be there. The other thing is that the RSPB recommends that if you've got the space to have a tree, ideally something over about 2 metres in height, because they provide so much. There's shelter and also very often wonderful berries like this, so you've got food as well. And if you haven't got space for something that's about 2 metres or above, then perhaps a wall train shrub. Could be a pyracantha or a cotoneaster, which is also smothered in bees. Any of those things provide these wonderful berries. And then you'll find also that you get along the base of them slugs and snails sort of hiding beneath. And again, they provide food for the birds through the winter. So you've got the whole thing, the shelter, somewhere to build a nest, the food source, and it all comes together beautifully. Now, Nick went to visit a garden in Norwich, where the owner is an entomologist, and he has designed his garden so that it's beneficial for as wide a range of little creatures as possible. Not only the insects, but wildlife in general.
No doubt you've seen these in your garden. You might fear them, or sometimes you might just feel revolted. Or for some people, it can even lead to hatred. Today, I've come to meet a man who's really keen to change our perception between what's friend and foe in the garden. Dr. Ian Bedford is a retired entomologist and passionate gardener, and he believes with a few tweaks to the way you garden, you can welcome in a much, much wider range of wildlife. Ian, your garden is really beautiful, and I think it goes some way to sort of shirk that idea that a lot of people have, that in order to support wildlife and pollinators, you've got to have a messy garden.
It's basically just providing the essentials that wildlife need. You know, it doesn't have to be left to grow wild. Anybody who's gardening can create their garden as they want it. And I think that's got to be important, really, so that you're happy with your garden. And just make it wildlife friendly. As an entomologist, it's sensible if you just provide the things that the wildlife need and start at the bottom with the bugs. So, you know, the garden really just provides shelter, safety and food. You know, the key thing is that they've got to be safe. There mustn't be toxins in the garden, so things come along and perhaps, you know, have a feed on the nectar and pollen and pick up a systemic pesticide.
We're stood in front of your veg patch here. It looks pretty traditional in terms of its layout, but what I notice about it that's a bit different is it's absolutely full of different creatures.
Yeah, because they're not actually affecting the plants. So why would I want to get rid of them? To me, they are food for others. So, and you know, we've seen here that we've got black bean aphids on the broad beans, but we've also got ladybird pupae, we've got ladybird larvae. So it's working. You know, we're attracting in the next layer of that food chain.
This is, of course, Mechanopsis cambrica, or the Welsh poppy, and it's absolutely covered in insects.
Yes, the little pollen beetles. And they're attracted to this colour yellow. In fact, they caused a problem for Norwich City Football Club a few years ago when they changed the colour of their shirts.
I remember wearing a yellow T-shirt as a child and being smothered in them, yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? But they're not doing any harm. All they're doing is sitting there, feeding on the pollen, and then later on in the year, they'll be off to lay their eggs on certain wildflowers.
Another way we can encourage biodiversity is to stop thinking of our gardens as just our own. That can be hard, but try to think of gardens as a series of links from the wild landscape into the urban.
I like to think of gardens being a stepping stone, so that we can connect these different protected zones through our gardens. For this garden, I have to make sure that I have, you know, shade, got the trees, a lot of ground cover. I've got water, which is essential as well, and you know, the flowers that will sustain the creatures which need to continually feed on nectar.
I guess one of the key things in terms of supporting pollinators is longevity and single flowers. And actually this is a brilliant example, isn't it? Rissam Bowles mauve never stops flowering, and they're single open individual flowers. Plants like the rose back here, not so much so, but you can see certain points the centre of the flower is open. But generally, as a principle, single flowers like this are much better. Actually, the hedge as well, it can provide home to all sorts of species.
This area that hasn't been clipped is absolutely full of birds' nests. I see the butterflies that come in. And then under the hedge, little bumblebee nests. So I think, you know, managed properly, Lelandii can be good. And you'll notice also that I've let ivy grow up through it. Well, that's because we've got populations of holly blue butterflies here, and part of their life cycle involves ivy. The Lelandii hedge is a very important part of this wildlife garden, and yeah, you can see the birds coming out of there now.
When we think about introducing wildlife into our gardens, it tends to be the most glamorous creatures that we focus on, the likes of pollinating bees or butterflies. But, as Dr. Ian says, it's often the less attractive, less glamorous creatures that do some of the most important jobs in the garden for us.
They're the things which are actually involved in the composting and the recycling process of all organic matter, whether that's sort of animal matter or plant matter that's put back into the ground, and then the nutrients are released and make, you know, nice healthy soil. Each of them seems to have a role as well, like, you know, the woodlice. They're nocturnal feeders. They have to be in a moist location because they're actually terrestrial crustaceans. They feed on wood, as their name suggests, breaking down that wood and, again, recycling that. As far as the slugs go, you know, we've got 42 species of slugs in Britain. There's probably no more than 6 or 7 that are actually herbivorous, ones which cause damage to our plants. The slugs which do cause you the damage on your plants are invariably the little slugs. We've got the grey field slug and the black garden slug, which neither of them grow more than about 2 centimetres in length. We mustn't be trying to be too controlling over things. Eventually, you get to a point, it does take perhaps a few years before you get to that stage. Then the herbivorous creatures, the ones that, you know, so many of us call pests, will be kept at plant-safe levels by nature. And it really is just working with nature and enjoying it as well as it comes in.
I'm in the process of creating my own new garden, and I'm really keen to support as many beneficial insects as I possibly can. So I'll certainly be taking all sorts of ideas from Ian's garden here, including possibly creating a wildlife pond. I'll let you know how I get on.
I really love Ian's approach to his garden because he shows us that really we need to reassess what we think of as a friend and a foe. There are no such things as foes, it's all part of one big ecosystem. Now, still to come. Kate Bradbury shows us how she gardens on her allotment alongside an array of wildlife.
This tiny thing here is a hoverfly pupa. And any day now, a hoverfly is going to hatch out of here and join the huge world of the allotment, of big things eating little things and keeping my veg healthy.
And we visit a garden in the city where the wildlife is flourishing.
So here we have a flower crab spider. This spider waits to pounce on its prey, so it kind of tries to camouflage itself in amongst the flower head. It sometimes has an angry face, but it's really not dangerous to us, and they're actually very happy little fellas, especially when they've got a fat hoverfly.
When we think about wildlife, we think about those things that we can see that flutter and creep and crawl around us in the garden. But within our garden, there's a whole other domain that has barely been explored. It's as diverse as a rainforest. What am I talking about? The soil beneath our feet. Soil scientists believe there's more life in a teaspoon of soil than there are people on the planet. These soil organisms are vital for our gardens. They decompose organic material, resulting in nutrients that feed our plants and vegetables. Without them, our soil just wouldn't be fertile. I'm meeting soil biologist Dr. Matthew Shepherd from Natural England to find out more about the essential and minute wildlife beneath our feet.
Oh, hi, Arit.
What are you doing?
Well, I am sieving for soil organisms, and if we look carefully, we should be able to see some of the soil mesofauna that have come out. These are creatures that are still big enough to see, but they're small enough to fit through the holes in this sieve.
Ah.
So if we have a look, we might see something moving, and if you can see it moving, you can hoover it up with the pooter. So, there's one. You can see it's got little black body and red legs.
Yeah, got it.
I'll see if I can get it up the pooter. There we go.
Go on, he's up there.
Captured.
There's so many little creatures, aren't there?
Well, these ones you can actually see, but of course in amongst the soil there are huge numbers of microorganisms that include bacteria, fungi, nematodes, tardigrades, rotifers, but to see those we'd need a microscope.
Oh, I love this, the science station.
Ah yes, I've got all the kit here.
Why are you so passionate about soil?
Well, we actually need soil to do a lot of jobs for us. We need it to decompose waste, we need it to store carbon, we need it to hold on to water and release nutrients. And all of those are things which gardens need to have in order to function. So really, without soil, there would be no gardens. So I don't know if you'd like to have a quick look at some of the creatures that we've found.
Definitely.
So down here, I've got some in a petri dish that I collected earlier. I'll see if I can line one up for you and see if we can...
Things moving already just from
That's
here.
right. I mean, the soil is very much alive. Okay, there's one there. I'm just going to shine a light on it so you get a good view.
Oh, wow.
That's one of our oribatid mites. They're also known as moss mites. And although it looks a little bit like a spider, that's actually a decomposer. So what it does is it munches away on the fungi and the bacteria that are eating rotting wood or rotting leaves. So the dung that comes out of the back end of these little organisms is a rich source for nutrients and also can really hang on to water in the soil as well. And it's being deposited at a really small scale right next to the plant roots where these creatures live.
And that is amazing. I mean, there's actually so many other things as well that I can see just on the move.
Oh, that's right, yes. We've got springtails in here as well. Springtails are also decomposers. We've also got predators as well in the soil. That one there you can see is a predatory mite, and that will roam around. It's rather like a robot until it finds a springtail and it will grab it and effectively tear it to pieces.
Oh my gosh, look at this.
But even those are useful in the soil because, of course, we don't just have beneficial organisms in the garden, we do have some pests. But if you've got a wide variety of different predatory organisms, they can actually help to control root pests, for example, on your plants. So having a good diversity of predators is really important. So you've got animals living in the soil that live in the air spaces, but also creatures that live in the water spaces as well. And I've actually got a few of those under this microscope to look at.
Okay.
I've extracted these from a piece of moss because they're very easy to spot under moss. So have a look at that one there.
Now that looks incredibly
Alien?
crazy. Yeah, alien. I feel like I'm in a different world.
So that's a rotifer that you're looking at, and it's got a pair of organs on its head which are covered in little hairs, and it washes soil organisms like bacteria into its mouth using those hairs. And the way it moves them, it almost looks like that it's got wheels on its head, and that's where the name comes from, rotifer. They're sometimes called wheel animals. Wow. So that's a filter feeder in the soil.
As gardeners, you know, we are doing our best to improve the wildlife that we see, you know, the birds and bees and mammals, etc. But there's this whole other life going on, isn't there? There's other life force.
Most of the wildlife in the garden, arguably, is actually in the soil. So if you're interested in trying to conserve that wildlife, firstly, all organisms need food to live. So when you're putting compost or manure into the soil, or even just letting your grass clippings lie on the lawn, you're providing a source of food for soil organisms. But another thing that they really don't like is too much disturbance. If you start to disturb the soil, it's a little bit like an earthquake happening to these creatures. So no dig approaches to gardening are really quite beneficial for soil organisms.
Well, it is fascinating to see the very thing that we can sometimes, I guess, almost take for granted. We think about our plants, we want them to grow, but there is this living web that's going on underneath. It's just been brilliant to see it. Now we're off to Clapham to meet a gardener who is passionate about bees.
This is a little common carder bumblebee. and it's rather cold, sadly, on this day today, so we kind of, on my hand, it's just warming up a little bit. It's quite a nice little encounter. Well, I'm Benny Hawksby, spelt in the correct way with the B-double-E. Clearly, I was meant to have a passion for bumblebees and the all other 280 species roughly in the UK that we've got of wild bee. It's obviously it was written in the stars. I'm the head gardener of the Eden Nature Garden in Clapham. I'm actually the only paid gardener here, but my team is a really wonderful team of local volunteers. It is a little Eden. It's a little oasis in the heart of London. Some people say it's a slice of the countryside, but in many ways it's got more diversity than the countryside. This is technically church land, it's consecrated land. The site is divided into two halves, so the church proper and then the nature garden this side. Before I got here, this was a bare, empty site, a dumping ground, and my predecessors started to build up a really special place here in the heart of the city where people could come and respect it and enjoy it. The main focus is to attract as many different species into the garden as possible. We don't follow the entire horticultural rule book. We embody a controlled wildness, and that's not always easy to achieve. You can't just let an area completely go feral. You've got that degree of management. One of the really basic things of a wildlife garden is to try and not just think about how the wildlife will eat and forage, it's about where they're going to reside and where they're going to nest. So we are trying our absolute best to provide all kinds of habitat in the garden. So this is one of our long herbaceous borders. It's got a real mix of some of your garden classics, but interspersed we've got lots of kind of wild native planting. Not everything you'd classify as a garden plant. Your green alkanet, your viper's bugloss, a very, very nice plant. Black horehound is definitely not a plant that most people would grow, but a little bit of it is really nice for bees. So this phlomis is a lovely plant, good for pollinators. What I've got here is not through my lack of pruning or laziness, it's some intentionally left stems. By the horticultural book, you'd be cutting those back after they've flowered, after they've set seed, but they're really good as little mini insect hotels for spiders, little beasties that can reside in there in the colder nights or through the winter even. I think a lot of people would call these plants weeds right here. You know, your hogweed, your ribwort plantain, your jack by the hedge or your garlic mustard, but they're really, really key plants in a wildlife garden. Hogweed must be kept in check, but you can see even right now it's covered in pollinators. Jack by the hedge, we grow it because of the orange-tip butterfly. Now the caterpillars of the orange-tip butterfly, they really love this plant. They use it as one of their key food sources, and so we try to encourage people to keep some of this in their gardens, and it's a really, really important plant here for us and our wildlife. I studied as a marine biologist, actually, so a little bit away from horticulture, but many, many parallels I've come to realise. Plants were the missing piece of the puzzle for me. I didn't realise that would be the case until I really got into them, and bees and plants and all other wildlife that comes with it just really, really excite me. So here we have a flower crab spider. This spider waits to pounce on its prey, so it kind of tries to camouflage itself in amongst the flower head. And in this case, a Phacelia, they'll wait for an unsuspecting hoverfly to come into the flower and pounce, take it down, and that would be its meal. It sometimes has an angry face, but it's really not dangerous to us, and they're actually very happy little fellas, especially when they've got a fat hoverfly. This echinopsis is teeming with bumblebees. I think we've got at least 2 species on there right now. So the buff-tailed bumblebee is one of the most common bumblebees in the UK, a really nice, classic-looking bumblebee, and we've got plenty of them here. The similar appearing cuckoo bumblebees are also more prevalent here right now, but they don't have their own workers, they don't collect pollen, they utilise the hard work of some of the other bumblebees to reproduce. So much like a cuckoo bird, you've got cuckoo bumblebees as well. This piece of wood came from the tree pruning work in the garden, and as you can see, some of the bark's been stripped off. The beetles have stripped the bark, and then the squirrels have used this kind of layer as their nesting material. So we're happy for that to happen, but it's also a bench for people, so people are not losing out. So this was actually a formal lawn, and we converted it into a mini meadow 4 years ago. So now we have a kind of a frog nursery, and especially in a damp summer like last year, we had thousands of froglets using it as an area of safety and probably feeding as well. We've had the goldfinches coming down onto ground level. We're using the dandelion seed heads as bird feeders on the ground, which is really exciting to see. You'll often find me staring into the meadow, you know, what's that moving in there? Could be an insect, could be a frog. It is an exciting area, and people do find themselves sitting around the mini meadow just kind of, you know, taking a breath and just watching it, really. We do have some rare visitors in this garden, actually. One of them is a thread-waisted wasp, one of the first records in the UK, around 2016, and we've been seeing it every year. So really, really exciting. Just here, in the most unlikely of places, a hornet moth, which is the first time ever in the garden. So it's mimicking a hornet, clearly, and I initially did think it was a hornet, just kind of looking at this, but it's a moth, so it's a beautiful insect and it's absolutely harmless. Yeah, this is quite a special insect here, and I've never seen one in London before. I love this small space because I feel a part of it, really. I do live and breathe it, to be fair. Plants and wildlife, it is more than a job. Every time I walk through the garden and I see a bee, a spot of butterfly, you hear a bird, the excitement doesn't wane.
It's great that Benny has thrown away the horticultural rule book and attracted so much into the garden. But it's not just at daytime that we get visitors into our spaces. At night, there's a host of nocturnal fauna that arrives in our garden, and moths are some of the most fascinating. Hello, what have we got here then?
We've got a moth trap.
Okay. Jan has been regularly recording the hundreds of moths in her garden. So tell me, Jan, you know, with moths, we see the lights on at night, we see them flying about, but what is it about them that's so important?
I mean, they're very important pollinators, but the other thing is they're really important food for other wildlife. I sat on that swing seat up there one summer's evening and counted the seconds in between a great tit going into the nest and coming out, two parents going in and out, and the chicks were being fed every 30 seconds. So they had to find all those caterpillars off these trees here, and most of those will have been moth caterpillars.
Yeah.
And moths are important for bats as well. So, you know, it's all part of the ecosystem, and we don't know sometimes if we take something out of the ecosystem, what else is going to be affected down the line.
So how many types of moths are there?
2,500 species of moths in Britain, whereas there's only about 60 species of butterfly. This is a lovely one called a magpie.
Oh, yeah.
See, it's black and white.
They are quite pretty, actually. You could actually think that was actually a butterfly.
Well, you see, scientifically, they're all the same. They're all part Lepidoptera, which just means scaly wings that give the colours and things. Very often it's for camouflage, sometimes it's for attracting females.
Can you tell me about the life cycle of moths?
They lay their eggs at different times of year, depending on the species. Then the egg can sometimes last all through the winter on the tree that they lay them on, and then they will hatch out in the spring and eat the leaves. Sometimes they eat the flowers, and then they'll pupate, often on another plant. That's why people find these caterpillars walking across the lawn and surprised, because where is it going? Well, that's when it's ready to pupate. It gets off its larval food plant, so because that's where the predators know it will be. So it goes to find a place to hide in the hedge or something. And then they pupate into the moth. So best to just leave them if you find them let them get on with their own life cycle.
You Bob. So it really is important, isn't it, to be organic in the garden?
Oh,
because
yes.
otherwise that must...
Because it's going to affect every part of the life cycle. If you've got plants that the caterpillars are eating and it's got insecticide on it, obviously it's not going to be any good. If the blue tit then wants to feed that to their chick, then you're poisoning the blue tits as well. So you have to think about the whole system.
As gardeners, Jan, what can we do to encourage moths into the garden?
There are a lot of plants you can grow, as with butterflies, you can grow the larval food plants. This wonderful pink rosebay willow herb that I've let invade the garden is the larval food plant for the wonderful elephant hawk moth. This is called a poplar hawk moth because the caterpillar has to feed on poplar trees. Then you've got things like evening primrose and honeysuckle that open the flowers at night and put out their scent in the evening, and that's because they've evolved alongside moths to be pollinated them. And in the winter, things like common ivy is what the moths can hibernate in. Very often they also hibernate as pupae in the leaf litter. If you're sweeping up the leaf litter, you're actually sweeping up pupal stages of insects which are hibernating.
And that's really interesting because we're often quite quick to want to tidy the garden, aren't we?
Yeah.
So.
Well, in fact, when I started gardening, they used to tell you to sweep up and cut off all the dead bits because that's where these horrible pests would live over winter, you see. But now we're trying to actually protect these so-called pests, which aren't really.
Now it's time to visit one of your gardens. We're off to Shrewsbury.
Hi, I'm Chloe.
I'm Rory.
Welcome to our wildlife garden.
When we first came and looked at the house, it's the garden that really wowed us, and really it's the reason that we wanted to buy the house. And to begin with, we really thought, okay, well, there's nothing much for us to do here. More than anything, it's just really a matter of trying to maintain what there already is. But after a number of months, and certainly into the first spring, we realised that actually there was a lot more that we could do, and we could really make the garden our own. One of the best features in the garden for wildlife is, of course, the pond, and it's now home for just tons and tons of native creatures, so newts and frogs and damselflies. Really, for us, the more wildlife there is that uses it, the more joy we get out of it as a place, just seeing how much it's valued by all different walks of life, including our 18-month-old daughter. She's just fascinated by looking at all the different plants and flowers, sometimes picking them, and seeing the wildlife as well. And we feel as though hopefully it can be a really good education for her as a starting point to appreciating how much we need to look after nature and provide a home for wildlife as well.
My memories of running across the grass barefoot, I think they're some of the happiest that I have of my childhood. And of course in the UK we love our lawns. Possibly not quite the lawns that I grew up with, which were absolutely manicured, not a weed in sight. Now I think it's much more trying to find a way that we can enjoy having a lawn, but also that it's beneficial for all sorts of wildlife. And this, to me, is absolutely the way to go. So there are beautiful wildflowers growing all the way through it. You've got this lovely bird's foot trefoil, gets its name from once the flowers go over the seeds, they're sort of spread out like the foot of a bird. There's also knapweed. Now here, it's growing to about the height it would get to, still in bud. But there are also really short ones just going through the grass here, and that's because this grass is mown about once a month, so it has time to flower. If you cut it very low and you do that weekly, you'll get slow-growing things like daisies, but not that many. But if you mow once a month, then you allow them to produce plenty of flower, really beneficial for lots of pollinators. And if you don't have a lawn that already has this sort of diversity of plant life in it, then you can add to what you've got by buying these little plugs. This one is a red clover, again another fantastic plant for nectar particularly. And it comes in just these little plugs. You dig a hole through the grass, pop it in and they will soon begin to establish and spread. You can also plant self-heal, buttercups and cowslips for a bountiful spring lawn. And then if you can, round the edges of your lawn, have that lovely tall grass where the grass itself has flowered, providing seeds for the birds later in the season. That's fantastic, and you've got this wonderful tactile pleasure of being able to sweep your arm through those grasses. Now, we're off to Hove to visit wildlife expert Kate Bradbury's allotment, where she grows wonderful fresh produce and embraces a wealth of wildlife.
It was 6 years ago that I laid my hands on an allotment. I love it. I've got space to grow all sorts of veg. Courgettes, sweet corn, rhubarb, tomatoes, and lots of beans. I also grow more plants to create habitats for wildlife, because the more big things I can bring in to eat the smaller things, the more balanced the veg plot, and the better my veg grows. So I encourage pollinators to make sure my veg flowers flourish. And I give homes to predators like birds, frogs and ladybirds, and they eat the traditional pests that munch our veg. These homes and habitats are in small chunks around the plot. I've got lots of neat rows of veg, but I've also got a mixed native hedge here which I've planted for wildlife, and it's brought the sparrows in who take shelter in the hedge, but I've also found them eating aphids from my broad beans. I've got little patches of long grass where lots of things live and lots of frogs take shelter during the day, and these act as little stepping stones through the plot which helps them travel about. And of course, I've also got a pond, which is providing breeding habitats for frogs and newts and dragonflies and damselflies, but also a drinking spot for foxes and hedgehogs, and just a wealth of other wildlife that are coming in and drinking and bathing and breeding. If it seems a bit alarming, seeing a corner running wild or letting grass grow near your carrots, it's easy to start small. One sunny patch of nettles is a great first home for lots of butterflies and moths. So this nettle patch here is one big nursery. There is so much life going on here. This one here is the caterpillar of a red admiral butterfly. Red admirals lay their eggs singly, and to protect themselves from predators, this tiny caterpillar has folded over the leaf to make itself this gorgeous leafy duvet. And within this duvet, it's eating the bottom of the leaf, so it comes out at night and then spends its day just cocooned in this little leaf. Like small tortoiseshell caterpillars, who also like to live in nettles, there'll be no threat to your veg. These caterpillars only eat nettles. But the adults will soon be out pollinating your flowers. And there's more. This leaf is rolled rather than folded, and there's another caterpillar in here of the mother-of-pearl moth. It's quite an insignificant looking little brown moth, but there's loads of them living in here, as well as other caterpillars, lots of beetles, bugs. It's full of life. So if you grow nettles and you find a folded over leaf or a rolled up leaf, you know something's living in there. Something's made its home and is going through its life cycle. Typical tiny veg pests like blackfly are a constant pain in the garden, but to small predators like ladybirds, they're the perfect buffet. My broad beans get very busy. When plants are attacked by aphids, they send out signals of stress hormones which lure in the ladybirds and let them know that it's a really good place to lay their eggs, because their larvae eat lots and lots of aphids. And the wonderful thing I've got here is I've got all three stages of the ladybird life cycle. I've got the larvae, which you can see here, they look like little crocodiles, and they can eat up to 50 aphids a day. I've also got pupa, which it looks a little bit like a bird poo, but that's effectively the beetle equivalent of a chrysalis, in which the larvae is turning into an adult ladybird. This whole process takes just a few weeks, and so between the larvae and the adult ladybirds, You've got a lot of aphid munchers here, all doing you a great service and all being really fascinating to watch.
Ladybird eggs are long, yellow and often laid underneath leaves, which makes them easy to spot. But some eggs are more mathematical.
So I was going to chop this back because it's actually blocking the path and quite annoying, but I always check leaves before I put anything in the compost bin or cut things back, and I've found this tiny little cluster of shield bug eggs. They're laid in this really geometric sort of hexagonal pattern, which makes them really easy to identify. As these eggs hatch, they'll become food for lots of other species further up the food chain, like birds. But I hope lots of them aren't eaten and they grow into adult shield bugs, because I just think they're really lovely and I love having them around.
When it comes to protecting your veg from slugs and snails, frogs and birds do a great job, but they're not the only ones.
So these black plastic compost bins get really hot in the sun, and they're a magnet for slow worms, which are lizards and completely harmless. The best thing about slow worms is that they eat slugs. So I create a nice cosy habitat for them with grass clippings so they can get really nice and snug, and sometimes they have their babies in here.
And just by the pond, under a piece of corrugated iron, they like to warm up on sunny mornings.
Oh, there she goes. It's so fast because it's so warm today. It comes under here to soak up the sun's rays to get the energy to move around and eat all my slugs during the day. Sometimes when I lift up this corrugated iron, I can find 10 slow worms. It's actually quite unusual to find just one. But I know that hidden here in all of this habitat, there are other slow worms doing their thing, eating the slugs, eating the other bugs. And we don't have to see them to know that they're doing good things.
My veg plot is definitely not pristine. I have some black fly and the odd nibbled bean, but I also have fewer traditional pests, a buzzing plot, and masses of new life to discover.
This tiny thing here is a hoverfly pupa, and any day now, a hoverfly is going to hatch out of here and join the huge world of the allotment, of big things eating little things and keeping my veg healthy. And the extra joy that comes from all this is that the more I look, the more I find these wonderful things that are living alongside me. And I love getting to know them, no matter how small they are.
Isn't Kate's allotment inspiring?
I don't know how she manages to pack so much in. It's really inspirational.
And haven't we had the most fantastic day in North Wales, speaking of packing it in?
Well, I have to say, I've so enjoyed being here. It's such an immersive space. It's teeming with life, and I think it reminds us that, you know, we are custodians of the land and that we share our space with all of these creatures, all this wildlife, so we've got to look after it.
Well, that's all we've got time for, but Monty will be back at Longmeadow next Friday at 8 p.m. So until then,
goodbye.
Bye-bye. Kate's allotment inspiring.
I don't know how she manages to pack so much in. It's really inspirational.
And haven't we had the most fantastic day in North Wales, speaking of packing it in?
Well, I have to say, I've so enjoyed being here. It's such an immersive space. It's teeming with life, and I think it reminds us that, you know, we are custodians of the land and that we share our space with all of these creatures, all this wildlife, so we've got to look after it.
Well, that's all we've got time for, but Monty will be back at Longmeadow next Friday at 8 p.m. So until then,
goodbye.
Bye-bye.